this talk about how to communicate isClearly. My name is Thomas Gossman, or Gossi for short. I hope you are unprepared for this. Is fun, it will be. So what I want to do today is, the goal for this is for us to improve the communication with an interdisciplinary team. Where I want to do this is I want to shake and disrupt your naming skills. And why? Because of that, I want to trigger you to think in different ways for new vocabulary that will help you to speak with non-developers. So it's more like the role that we as developers take in speaking to others. So I go through three things here. The first is why we are not on-communicating isClearly. Second is how to on-detect to is not communicating clearly. And third is then how to communicate clearly, right? So the first one, I start with a bold statement. I think we do not communicate clearly on purpose. We do this unintentionally and in full awareness. And that's because of the language we use, right? So what's the language we use? We speak Devlish. It's not English, it's Devlish. And it comes with dialects. We have Krotlish, Restlish, Front-Endlish, and Back-Endlish. Right. So the example, we had this in the restaurant today, Aaron, right? We had lunch together. And this is how we entered the restaurant, and then this is what we told them. It's like, hey, you food order and delivery provider. Here's my on-order handler. And whenever you think I am is ready, please call it. This is how we sound as devs, right? This is how Devlish sounds. And the main important thing in the language is then the nouns and the verbs we have. So we eat nouns, we buy nouns from the store, we sit on nouns, we sleep on nouns. And then the nouns for this are kind of like the boring parts. They're just things. They're static, like a rock is a rock. Not very much exciting. On the other side, we have the verbs. They're the interesting part of the language. They make the thing dynamic. They change things, they mutate things, if you wish to say so. And then if we compare how developers use this English language, the first thing we need to think about is that even though we code in English for most of the time, not all of us are English speakers, so there's a lot of lost in translation situations we will have. And then there's this technical language that coming through the programming languages, which will have very high gravity on our words that we use, like crot, rest, or click. And then, of course, we have the two hardest problems in computer science, right? We have cache and validation. And in education, we will receive really good courses in where we learn how to solve the hardest algorithms, right? So we get this. And then the naming things. But who here ever had a linguistic course in university or their education? This is where they leave us into the wild. It's yeah, that's for you to figure out. But this is how we communicate with others. So this is never handled there. So let's go to the second part where how we can on-detect to is not communicating clearly. So I've tried these methods for myself. So I want to go over them with you and explain them to you, and then see how this is coming to a trap we built ourselves that we actually fall into. So the first one is sound of code, then finding the imposter, and the third is if we speak domain language. So let's go over the sound of code. It's like the sonification of code. I like sounds and noises. They're funny to me. I like to replicate them. Why not give some audio to the code we speak? So does the code that we write, does it tell the story? And the story that the code tells, is it the same story as the business and the domain? And if we have that sound of this code, does it sound wrong? So here's some code on the right, not very telling much. And for the things in the code, I underlined the words that I gave myself a name to. So this is this, which is a thing. We have onClick, and we have isOn. These are the things I named myself. I keep that like the component names button and icon. So what we can do now is to connect those words in the code execution order to tell the story. So let's do it for this code that we have here. It says onClick the button to onClick the thing to be isOn. That's the sound of code. That's devilish. Very much interesting, right? Very descriptive as well. So let's find the action, because this is like where the core is happening, right? So in this, the action is here. Button onClick equals onClick. Now, if we have that as a code, we can reverse engineer this into a user story. So how would the user story to this code look like or sound like? This is this. As a user, I want to onClick a button so that I can onClick. If that was the user story that your PM gave you and you implemented it this way, perfect. But I doubt it that this is the user story you get from them. But however, this is the code as we find it, as it speaks itself. And if we ever get to a code like this and we need to make some changes, we're kind of lost in understanding what the code is doing. Second method is finding the imposter. So verbs are the interesting part still. We use that for two things. The first one is verbs are as actions or instructions into the system. They mutate the things, they cause side effects. And then on the other side, we ask questions for facts that tell us about the system. So the actions or instructions, also known called the commands. We have, for example, request noun termination. We can sell noun, we can purchase noun. And on the other side, we have the queries, like the questions. Which noun method? Is noun available? Can purchase noun? And we know this already. This is the command query separation principle. Functions, and each of them has a certain purpose. So taking this, we can use this information to finding the imposter in our code. Like, we can ask ourselves, are the action actually that we have, are they commanding? And the questions we have, are they being asked? So if we look into the code again, going back to the things we underlined at first, this is our own naming that we do. We have thing, onClick, and isOn. And now we can ask ourselves, hey, is this thing an action? Is this thing a question? And is it being asked? So we can say the thing as a noun, okay, there's not much about it. But for the onClick and for the isOn, they are the imposters here. So let me explain each of them to you why I think so. So remember back this as our story of the code. OnClick the button to onClick the thing to be isOn. What's the action here? And what's the question? If we turn that code into prose, then the actions are the verbs in the sentence that we can derive from that. So for the English grammar, we have subject, verb, object. So Peter visits school or so, right? So if we turn that now, turn our code into prose, like take this one. We have a customer, we have pay with credit card, and then a thing. So I underlined the sentence parts, like the customer, pay, and the thing. So we can turn it into a sentence like saying customer pays for a thing. We can even turn this now into a question like, can a customer pay for a thing? Yes, we do have the method for it. Now, if we do and prefix this with an on, now the on becomes the verb. So if we derive the sentence from here, we have customer on for a thing. And the question to that is, can a customer on for a thing? And now, during my software education, my apprenticeship, my educator used to call me or throw me this sentence at me, this sentence no verb. And this is what we have here. We have the verb as the first thing to actually command thing, is not there. So we have onVerb noun, it's our first imposter. It wants to be a command, but it does on, whatever that means. Second question, second imposter is like, do we have questions and do we ask them? So here we have this code, if has potatoes, what inside of the code block, what can we be true about in here? Well, to explain that, it's not the best explanation, but I hope it's somewhat related. So I'll leave that to you now to read it for you. And if we put that back into code, here we have has potatoes. It always turns true because it may be a function, and the function is always there. So we always go into the if block. So the thing is, question known has potatoes or questions being asked if we invoke them. But this is like a tricky thing because it's verbs versus facts. So the answer of a question is a fact about the system. Do we have potatoes? Yes or no. And then we can have the yes or no as an ingredient or a criteria that we can put into conditions. So if we rewrite this from before, we have the question, has potatoes, we ask the question, we get back a fact, an information, that the potatoes are available, and then we can put the potatoes available into the if as a condition, and we check for the fact rather than if a question is there or not. So I think it gets a bit more tricky when we think about getters, because getters, they look like a function, because they can have arbitrary code. And this sounds like this is a function that is called, but it's a property that is accessed. So it's a fact, or a computed fact in this case, rather than a function that we explicitly invoke. So if we have has potatoes here instead of potatoes available, then we have this get verb noun thingy, which on the one hand wants to be a fact, but is masked as a question, or on the other side, it wants to be a question, but it's masked as a fact. So we introduce ambiguity into our naming, into our system, and one kind of people call this, the others is like, okay, we just access it. So that's what do you do in your coding? And I've seen mixture of this in code bases. So it's really hard to navigate and understand what's going on. So where is this coming from is a question I ask myself. And one thing is, like in HTML, we have some element, then we had onClick attribute, especially like in 1997, 98. This was the only way to add interactivity to the site. Later on, we get add event listener and attached listener from IE, and then like from there on, like it had its own journey. And the second thing for why I think this is the origin for this is perhaps the Hungarian notation. So in the Hungarian notation, you prefix the variables with like a single or two characters that indicate the type. So a be noun, that's a Boolean, and we now use is noun or has noun. Or we have fn verb, which we now turn into an onVerb or function. So this might be a thing. And maybe we have developed the Hungarian notation of frontend due to this. Not sure, but like it may be. Third method to detect whether we are not communicating clearly is how we use our favorite verbs in programming. Yeah, the magnets that we are always drawn to. And what stories do we tell through this? And there's a couple of things where we have a strong naming convention, and the first one is CRUD, right? So we have create, read, update, and delete. And now there's a talk from Golo, and he said, you can't tell a bedtime story with only the verbs create, read, update, and delete. Well, challenge accepted. After I submitted this talk to this meetup, shortly after Golo himself released a video in where he did that, so this is the one linked here, It's in German, so I kind of like do the English translation now in like little adaptation. So this is the story. I will read it out loud so you don't have to read it, right? So, but you maybe close your eyes. It's a bedtime story, right? So, once upon a time, there was a king and queen who wished themselves a daughter. The wish came true and a princess was created. One day, the princess updated her location to the big dark forest and retrieved there is a big gray wolf. In an assault, the big gray wolf updated the isDeleted flag of the princess to be true. King and queen updated the profile status to sad. The king also updated the hunter's location to the big dark forest and the task to delete the big gray wolf. The brave hunter deleted the big gray wolf and updated the isDeleted flag of the princess to false. And if they haven't been deleted, they lived happily ever after. What a wonderful bedtime story, isn't it? So vibrant, so exciting to tell. Amazing. Devilish. So there's more languages that come with a set of verbs like post, get, put and patch, delete for rest. And there's also in front end, we have click, mouse down, touch start. It's all of the DOM events that come with a kind of like a standard for verbs. Now, if we put that all together, and it actually fits nicely, right? So from CRUD to REST, that's a nice mapping from create to post, and all the others as well. So why not use it? Cool. The thing is, this is the technical language. So if we go from a click to a post to a create, if we just see these words, what feature is this? And why does every application has it? But this is devilish. So we build a trap through this. We build a trap to the sound we onCreate, to the imposters we onAccept, and through the technical language we onUse. So let's have a little bit of a discussion about this. So the first thing, like using this kind of prefixing, I heard that it shall sound more natural to do this, but it actually causes some ambiguity and perhaps not that much natural as I showed. People say it's faster, like that's definitely given. You look for the prefixes and then whatever the rest approximately does what you're looking for, that's fine. However, we will put our focus more on the ons and the is's and the has's and the shalls and the woulds and the wills instead of what comes after, which is the interesting part because that's where the business is described. And it actually avoids us to think like, okay, cool, we have more on, and then afterwards I just use what approximately gets there. And we think in the grammar of the programming language. Hey, this is a getter, this is an accessor, this is a function, this is a class or whatever. And sometimes it prevents us from thinking in facts or in questions and actions. Some have linter rules to force you into this kind of thinking. But yeah, I think there's a lot of information missing if we deny this from us. Okay, third part, how to communicate clearly now. First is use English, not devilish. Translate from a technical to domain language. And lastly, how to become a product-minded software engineer. Use English, like asking questions versus checking facts. Like, don't do like hashed potatoes. It isn't clear what this is, because the name says it's a function, but the type says it's a property. So be clear in the naming so it matches the type in this case. So think more about questions and facts. Same goes for computed or getters. And then ask your questions. You can do this on the template. So here on the left is with Octane. I'm using, like, as an example, I use Ember can here. So we have can. That's the invocation on template. and then the question afterwards. Or in the future with Polaris and template imports, we can actually import the question and then use it in the template. Use active verbs for actions. So instead of on, proceed, payment, just call it pay. That's the active verb to it, but it's sometimes so hard to think about what's the active verb to that. And translate from the technical to domain language. So here, there's CRUD, REST, and DOM events. And each of those is the technical language. And CRUD, REST, and DOM events even as well. They're fine if you like working on the database or on the HTTP API interface. This is good there to use this language. But as long as it leaves this boundary, we need to translate. So here's how we can do that, for example. So in CRUD, we can put a repository in front where we pipe this through our own language of the domain. Or we can use technologies like event sourcing, where you only append to a database. In REST, you can, if you want to leave JSON API, you can limit yourself to only get and post, gets for reads, post for mutations. And then whatever is the post is like a function to the backend. You can think about this, and then you can use your own business logic to it, and business naming as well. Or use different technologies like GraphQL or sockets. So there's a good example how you can test for yourself if you're using technical language or domain language. Think about this. You have an endpoint to fetch a resource by ID. And you pass in the ID and you get back a 404, not found. But what didn't you found there? What didn't you not found there? Is the endpoint not there, or is the resource not there? If the endpoint is not there, it's a 404 for sure. But if you hit the endpoint and you can't find the resource, that's perhaps not a 404 because you hit the endpoint. So to test this is, okay, you would do this in REST, but if you use GraphQL or sockets and send the same request over this communication channel, what would be the error in these technologies? And if this is not a 404 because the connection is established, then it's perhaps the wrong error on the wrong layer. And for DOM events, well, we can look into this now. So translating from the technical to the domain language. So here is a button component. We have a button. It has an on modifier, listening on click, and we do add push. So the first part is the technical name, and then we translate into add push the domain name, because apparently buttons are pushed and not on-clicked. And we can do the same here as well. So here's another example. This is a list, a mailbox and a list of mail. It's just only one as a representative here. So we have swipe left, which is the technical thing. And then we go into this delete. So we translate from the technical to the domain name. Remember our user story from the beginning? So as a user, I want to unclick a button so that I can unclick. If we reframe or rephrase this user story into this, where we can say, as a user, I want to push a button so that I can turn on the lights. With our freshly created button, we can put this in here. We have a button, and we pass in add push, this turn on the lights. So here, the code is matching the same language as the user story. So we establish the synchronicity between the code and the business language. We actually use the same words, and it's super hard to do. And apparently, you can use the same user story and hand this off to an electrical engineer who can install as a button into a wall and connect it to a light, because this is not technical language in there. So try this for yourself. Hey, can I give this user story to somebody else? So here in this case before, we used an assignment between modifier and a function we call directly. But this will not always be the case that we can do this kind of translation. So we need some kind of proxy methods for some ideas. So here's an form. We have an onSubmit, and then this called submit. and the submit is kind of like the technical proxy. So the function we call here, the method, is we collect the data at first. It's still the technical part. We have a form somewhere in the page, so we need to like collect the information there, and then we pass it off to the business logic. So it's kind of like a translation proxy method. All right. So on becoming a product-minded software engineer with all of this, so some don'ts and do's instead that I applied over the last year that helped me. So first is, don't assimilate the domain, the product, the business with your technical language. Instead, the code should adapt the language from the domain. Use Devilish. No, don't use Devilish. Use English instead. Easier said than done. Instead of naming the properties, getters, and methods, like the technical parts of the programming language, instead practice the naming of questions, actions, and facts about the domain. And then treat your code as like a blog post article and revise the words in there. So don't submit or publish the first draft. It perhaps doesn't sound the best, but go through the naming once more to make it sound like something nice, right? That also helps to extract the business logic from the components somewhere outside. And then the components all become like the glue between the UI and the business logic. That also helps you to unit test your business logic. And you only need to write the business logic once and connect it to multiple components, which you might find is also not like detectable on the first place. Yeah, this is just one line and I put it into a component, and you will realize later, okay, this is heavy business logic. That's not easy. So I hope I gave you some hints on where you can improve your naming skills. What helps is to make an inventory of the ubiquitous language about your domain, where you put in the aggregates, the entities, or the value objects, like the nouns, the actions or commands and questions and facts. You can do this in collaboration with designers. We used OOUX as the method here. We also do this in collaboration with domain experts, so definitely non-developers. We used event storming here, for example, so whatever fits you. Practice domain-driven design, which helps to not think about the technical parts. And then this gives you vocabulary to you and your team, so you can communicate with other people as well, which helps you to culture your domain, right? You have a different vocabulary. You're not speaking like the technical language anymore, and then you can better speak with your designers, your product people, or from the QA department. And ideally, you land on one language, and then you're good to go. And then it also helps you to validate the product features and operations, like a feature request is coming in. It's like, well, this feature request competes with this one, and because of the other person who cannot do this. So you validated the product without even looking at the code, because you already have the domain in your head. And actually, that's it. So this is my references. Thank you.
Thanks, Gossi. Interesting talk. Interesting. And Andre says, thank you for caring about code readability. Too many times has this aspect not been given attention it deserves. Can you see it as a code style guide? Can we standardize this? I guess he's referring to something like linting this.
Yeah, actually, we thought about this, and if this is possible, at least you can perhaps, I've seen a linter rule that says, hey, your booleans must begin with is and has and stuff like that. So maybe you can inverse that to do this. Maybe an interesting thing I thought as well is what I did here with underlining the words that I named myself is to make this as a tool that detects the source code, analyzes the language, uses natural language processing, and then turns your code into prose automatically. If anybody is doing that here, please let me know. But I think this is something like where you can analyze how the code is speaking and if the speaking is matching the business. I don't know, somewhere in this area, I think that's an interesting part, because I think that will perhaps reveal some surprises.
Yeah. It sounds like a research project for a
Yes.
PhD or something like that. We have 2 more questions here.
Okay.
How would you implement non-devlish in large teams? For example, using push might not be obvious for some devs, right? So it's...
Sure. Yeah, that's super hard. We only did this within like a small team. Like we were like 5 to 10 people. Most of them, like we had like half developers, half non-developers. So we had like a good discussion already there on how to get to this language. What we did is, as a result, is we had some sort of like a diagram where we documented like the domain in like aggregates and entities, and we had the event storming before where we like understand the events that is happening in the space. So we connected this all together. So you have like a huge mirror board, and this helped us to actually explain the domain to like new people joining the team, or explaining to the domain to other teams that like had to use or had to work with that. And we were creating this board with domain experts. So we as devs, we had no understanding of how the thing working, because we can look at the code. But when you go together and like write down the language, then okay, we had like these cases where we had like lots of technical language then there, and then of course the domain expert will use the totally different thing or like totally different language, and like aligning this helps to like make this language make yourself use this language and use this to teach to others. So when you're like explaining a feature, use this language that you gathered like from domain experts.
And I guess the last question, relates to that, and it is: can you see this approach fit into BDD or Cucumber? And
yeah, actually, we have our QA sitting over there. So this was a really good conversation because my testing instructions to my QA, for most of the things I was able to actually use like Gherkin syntax or syntax alike. And if you can do that, you will not think about the technical language. You have to think about the domain language. What's happening when a customer does this and customer does not update the database. So a customer like purchase a thing instead. And so with this language you have, you can actually formulate Gherkin like testing strings or criteria quite easily. Like this becomes a no-brainer then.
So I would say another round of applause for Gossi. Thanks.